What happens when two of country music's biggest personalities clash on live television, and a simple interview question ignites a firestorm that nobody saw coming? Today, we're diving into the explosive confrontation between Keith Urban and Kelly Clarkson that had everyone talking. So make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because this story gets wild. The Kelly Clarkson show was supposed to be just another routine promotional appearance for Keith Urban. He was there to discuss his latest album, maybe share a few behind-the-scenes stories, and connect with Kelly's massive daytime television audience. But what started as friendly conversation quickly turned into something much more intense when Kelly decided to ask about a topic that clearly struck a nerve. "So Keith, I have to ask you about something that's been making waves in the industry," Kelly began, leaning forward in her chair with that signature smile that usually puts guests at ease. "There's been some talk about authenticity in country music lately, and I'm curious about your thoughts on artists who some say have strayed too far from the genre's roots." Keith's expression shifted almost immediately. The easygoing demeanor he'd maintained throughout the first part of the interview seemed to tighten, and his fingers drummed once against the armrest of his chair. "Well, Kelly, that's quite a loaded question, isn't it? I mean, what exactly are you getting at here?" "I'm just wondering," Kelly continued, seemingly unaware of the tension building, "how you respond to critics who say that some artists, yourself included, have moved too far into pop territory. There was that article last month that specifically mentioned your recent collaborations and questioned whether you're still making country music or if you've crossed over completely." The studio audience, which had been warm and engaged just moments before, seemed to sense the shift in energy. Keith Urban sat back in his chair, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the studio lights overhead. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "You know what, Kelly? I find it interesting that you'd bring up an article like that without even asking me first if I wanted to discuss it. This feels a lot less like an interview and a lot more like an ambush to me." Kelly's eyes widened slightly, clearly caught off guard by Keith's response. "Keith, I didn't mean it that way at all. I'm just trying to have an honest conversation about the evolution of country music. You're one of the most successful artists in the genre, and I thought you'd want to address some of these discussions that are happening." "Address what exactly?" Keith's voice was rising now, and his Australian accent seemed more pronounced as his frustration grew. "Address the fact that people want to put me in a box and tell me what kind of music I should or shouldn't make. Address the fact that apparently success means you're not authentic anymore." The tension in the studio was palpable now. Kelly shifted, uncomfortably in her seat, clearly realizing that this conversation had taken a turn she hadn't anticipated. "Keith, that's not what I'm saying at all. I think your music is incredible, and I've always been a huge fan. I was just hoping to get your perspective on some of the industry conversations that are happening right now." "My perspective?" Keith laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Here's my perspective, Kelly. I've been making music for over 2 decades. I've won multiple Grammy Awards, I've sold millions of albums, and I've stayed true to who I am as an artist throughout all of it. So when someone sits across from me on national television and basically asks me to defend my artistic choices based on what some critic wrote in a magazine, yeah, I have a problem with that." The studio audience was completely silent now, all eyes focused on the two superstars as their conversation grew more heated by the moment. Kelly took a deep breath, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "Keith, I really think there's been a misunderstanding here. I wasn't asking you to defend anything. I was simply trying to facilitate a discussion about how country music has evolved, and I thought you might have some insights to share given your experience and success in the industry." A discussion. Keith's voice was sharp now, cutting through the studio air like a knife. "Kelly, let me ask you something. When was the last time someone questioned your authenticity as a pop artist? When was the last time someone suggested that your success meant you weren't being true to your roots? Because I'm willing to bet it doesn't happen very often, does it?" Kelly opened her mouth to respond, but Keith continued before she could speak. "And you know what the real issue is here? It's not about authenticity at all. It's about the fact that country music, more than any other genre, seems to have this obsession with policing its own artists. We're supposed to stay in our lane. We're supposed to sound a certain way. We're supposed to dress a certain way. And God forbid we try to grow or evolve as musicians." "Keith, I understand that you're frustrated," Kelly said, her voice taking on a more defensive tone, "but I think you're reading something into this conversation that wasn't there. I was asking a legitimate question about industry trends, not making a personal attack on your music or your career. Weren't you though?" Keith shot back, "Because it sure feels like that's exactly what you were doing. And you know what the most frustrating part is? This kind of conversation happens all the time in country music, but it never seems to happen to certain other artists. It's always the ones who dare to try something different, the ones who collaborate outside the genre, the ones who push boundaries even a little bit." The exchange was becoming more intense with each passing moment, and it was clear that both Keith and Kelly were feeling the heat. The studio audience remained frozen, watching as two beloved entertainers engaged in what was quickly becoming a very public disagreement. Kelly straightened in her chair, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a firmness that matched Keith's intensity. You know what, Keith? I think you're being unfair here. I've had plenty of country artists on this show, and I've never had a conversation go this direction before. Maybe the issue isn't with the questions I'm asking. Maybe the issue is with how you're choosing to interpret them. That statement hit Keith like a slap across the face, and the change in his demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. He leaned forward in his chair, his jaw clenched tight, and when he spoke, his words came out slow and deliberate. So now, it's my fault. Now I'm the problem, because I don't appreciate being blindsided on your show with questions designed to make me look like I've sold out. That's rich, Kelly. That's really rich. Kelly's face flushed slightly, and it was clear that she was struggling to maintain her composure. Keith, I think we need to take a step back here. This conversation has gotten completely out of hand, and I don't think either of us intended for it to go this direction. Oh, I think you knew exactly where this was going, Keith replied, his voice getting louder with each word. You had that article ready to reference. You had your questions all lined up, and you probably thought I'd just sit here and give you some diplomatic answer about how country music is evolving and everyone's entitled to their opinion. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not going to play that game. The studio crew was starting to look nervous now, glancing at each other and then back at the interview that was spiraling completely out of control. Kelly took a deep breath and tried once more to redirect the conversation. Keith, I genuinely did not bring you here today with any intention of ambushing you or making you uncomfortable. I've interviewed hundreds of artists over the years, and I've always tried to ask thoughtful questions that give them a chance to share their perspectives. If I've somehow offended you, that was not my intention. Your intention doesn't matter, though, does it? Keith shot back. What matters is what you actually did. And what you did was sit me down in front of your audience and your cameras and basically asked me to justify my artistic choices based on what some critic thinks about my music. Do you have any idea how insulting that is? Kelly's patience was clearly wearing thin now, and when she responded, there was steel in her voice. You know what, Keith? I think you're being incredibly unfair and, frankly, a little paranoid. I asked you a simple question about industry trends, and you've turned it into some kind of personal attack. Maybe you need to examine why you're so defensive about your own music. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Keith's reaction was immediate and explosive. He stood up from his chair so quickly that it nearly toppled backward, and the studio audience collectively gasped. Defensive? You think I'm being defensive? Lady, I've been in this business longer than you've been singing professionally, and I don't need to defend my music to anyone, especially not to someone who's never walked a day in country music's shoes. Kelly remained seated, but her posture was rigid and her eyes flashed with anger. Excuse me, someone who's never walked in country music's shoes. I may not be a country artist, but I know music. Keith, I know good music when I hear it, and I know authenticity when I see it. And right now, what I'm seeing is someone who's so insecure about their own artistic choices that they can't handle a simple question without having a complete meltdown. The studio had gone completely silent except for the sound of Keith's heavy breathing and the electrical hum of the equipment. Even the production assistants had stopped moving, frozen in place as they watched this unprecedented confrontation unfold. Insecure, Keith's voice was dangerously quiet now. You want to talk about insecurity, Kelly? Let's talk about a talk show host who has to tear down successful artists to make herself feel relevant. Let's talk about someone who probably practiced that question in the mirror to make sure it sounded just innocent enough that she could claim she didn't mean anything by it when things went south. Kelly stood up now too, facing Keith across the small interview set. You are way out of line. Keith Urban, way out of line. I have never, in all my years of doing this show, had a guest speak to me this way, and I'm not going to start tolerating it now. And I've never had a host try to humiliate me on live television, Keith fired back. So I guess we're both having new experiences today, aren't we? Tension between them was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Kelly's hands were clenched at her sides, and Keith's face was flushed with anger. For a moment, it seemed like the confrontation might escalate even further, but then Kelly took a step back and spoke in a voice that was deadly calm. You know what, Keith? I think this interview is over. I think you need to take some time too. Cool down and figure out why a simple question about your music sent you into such a tailspin. Because from where I'm standing, your reaction says a lot more about your insecurities than my question ever could. Keith let out a harsh laugh that echoed through the studio. My insecurities. That's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. You invite me onto your show. You try to embarrass me with loaded questions, and when I call you out on it, suddenly it's about my insecurities. You know what, Kelly? You're right about one thing. This interview is over. But not because I need to cool down. It's over because I don't have to sit here and listen to this garbage from someone who clearly doesn't respect me or my music. If you don't feel respected, Keith, maybe you should look at how you're treating the person who invited you here as a guest, Kelly replied, her voice rising again. Maybe you should consider that your behavior right now is completely inappropriate and unprofessional. Keith's voice cracked with incredulity. You want to talk about unprofessional? How about ambushing a guest with controversial questions they weren't prepared for? How about trying to create drama for your ratings? How about sitting there, acting innocent, when you know exactly what you were trying to do? Kelly shook her head, and when she spoke, her words came out measured but fierce. Keith, I have built my career on treating my guests with respect and having genuine conversations with them. I have never, not once, brought someone onto this show with the intention of embarrassing them or creating controversy. The fact that you think that's what happened here says everything about your mindset and nothing about mine. Does it though? Keith challenged, because I'm pretty sure your producers are thrilled right now. I'm pretty sure they're already thinking about how they're going to edit this segment to make it as dramatic as possible. I'm pretty sure this is exactly the kind of content you were hoping for when you decided to ask me about that article. The accusation hung between them like a lit fuse, and Kelly's expression shifted to something that looked almost like hurt before hardening back into anger. Kelly's face went pale at Keith's accusation, and for a moment she looked genuinely wounded by his words. But that vulnerability lasted only seconds before her expression hardened into something colder than anything she'd shown so far in the confrontation. You know what, Keith? That is absolutely disgusting. The fact that you would accuse me and my team of setting you up for ratings is not only wrong, it's insulting to everything I've built here. Do you really think so little of me that you believe I'd sabotage a guest just for television drama? Keith crossed his arms and stared her down. I think you're a smart businesswoman who knows exactly how this industry works. I think you know that controversy sells, and I think you saw an opportunity to create some with a question that you knew would push my buttons. Don't act like you're some innocent victim here, Kelly. Push your buttons. Kelly's voice was incredulous now. Keith, if asking about industry trends pushes your buttons, then maybe you need to examine why you're so sensitive about your place in country music. Maybe the critics have a point if you can't even discuss it without losing your mind. That statement was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Keith took a step closer to Kelly, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Don't you dare stand there and validate those critics. Don't you dare suggest that their narrow-minded garbage has any merit whatsoever. You have no idea what it's like to have your authenticity questioned every time you try to grow as an artist. And you have no idea what it's like to be attacked by a guest for doing your job. Kelly shot back, not backing down despite Keith's intimidating posture. I've had country legends on this show, Keith. I've had Dolly Parton. I've had Garth Brooks. I've had Carrie Underwood. Do you know what they all had in common? They were gracious, they were professional, and they didn't throw tantrums when asked about their music. Keith let out a bitter laugh. Oh, that's perfect. Now you're comparing me to other artists to make your point. That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's always about comparisons in country music, isn't it? It's always about who's more authentic, who's more traditional, who's more deserving of respect. Maybe it's about who handles criticism better, Kelly replied sharply. Maybe it's about who can have a professional conversation without making everything personal. Because right now, Keith, you're proving every single point those critics made about you. The words hit Keith like a physical blow, and for a moment, he looked genuinely stunned. Then his expression shifted to something that looked almost dangerous. What did you just say to me? Kelly held her ground, even though the tension in the studio was now so thick it was suffocating. I said, you're proving their point. You're acting exactly like someone who's lost touch with who they used to be. You're acting like someone who's forgotten where they came from. I haven't forgotten anything, Keith said through gritted teeth. But apparently you've forgotten that this is supposed to be an interview, not a therapy session where you psychoanalyze my career and my motivations. Who gave you the right to sit in judgment of my music or my character? I'm not judging your music, Keith. I'm judging your behavior right now, and it's completely unacceptable. You came onto my show, and when I asked you a legitimate question, you turned it into a personal attack on me and my integrity. That's not the behavior of someone who's secure in their artistic choices. Keith shook his head in disgust. Legitimate question, Kelly. Let me break this down for you since you seem to be missing the point. When you invite someone onto your show and then immediately bring up negative criticism about their work, that's not a legitimate question. That's a setup. That's an ambush. And the fact that you can't see the difference is exactly the problem. The problem, Keith, is that you're so wrapped up in your own ego that you can't handle any kind of critical discussion about your music. The problem is that you think being successful means you're above having to engage with different perspectives on your work. Different perspectives. Keith's voice was rising again. Is that what you call it when someone writes an article questioning whether I'm still a country artist? Is that what you call it when critics suggest that commercial success equals selling out? Those aren't different perspectives, Kelly. That's narrow-minded gatekeeping disguised as music criticism. Kelly threw her hands up in frustration. And this is exactly why I asked the question in the first place. This is exactly the kind of conversation that needs to happen in country music. But instead of engaging with it thoughtfully, you're having a complete breakdown on live television. A breakdown. Keith's voice cracked with disbelief. Lady, if standing up for myself and my music is a breakdown, then I'll have a breakdown every single day. I will not sit quietly while people question my authenticity or suggest that I've somehow betrayed the genre that made me who I am. Nobody's asking you to sit quietly, Keith, but there's a difference between defending your music and attacking the person asking the question. There's a difference between having passion for your art and having a meltdown because someone dared to bring up a topic you don't like. Keith ran his hand through his hair, and for a moment, he looked almost defeated. But then his resolve seemed to harden again. You know what, Kelly? I'm done trying to explain this to you. I'm done trying to make you understand why your approach was wrong. You want to sit there and act like you're the victim in this situation. Go ahead, but I'm not going to stand here and let you paint me as some kind of unstable artist who can't handle criticism. Then, what are you going to do, Keith? Kelly asked, her voice challenging. Because from where I'm standing, that's exactly what you look like right now. You look like someone who came onto my show expecting softball questions and got upset when I tried to have a real conversation with you. Keith stared at her for a long moment, and the entire studio held its breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with resolve. What I'm going to do, Kelly, is walk away from this disaster of an interview before it gets any worse. What I'm going to do is leave this studio with whatever dignity I have left after being ambushed. On national television, you're not being ambushed, Keith, you're being interviewed. There's a difference, even if you can't see it right now. Keith let out one final, bitter laugh. You know what the saddest part about all this is, Kelly? I actually used to respect you as an interviewer. I used to think you were someone who understood what it meant to be an artist, trying to stay true to yourself. Those words hung in the air like a death sentence for any remaining civility between them. Kelly's expression shifted from anger to something that looked almost like genuine hurt, but when she spoke, her voice was ice cold. Well, Keith, I guess the feeling is mutual now, isn't it? Because the Keith Urban I thought I was interviewing today wouldn't have turned a professional conversation into a personal attack. The Keith Urban I respected wouldn't have questioned my integrity and accused me of ambushing him, just because I asked about his music. Keith shook his head slowly, and there was something almost sad in his expression now. You still don't get it, do you? You still think this was just about asking about my music? Kelly, you brought up specific criticism. You referenced a specific article that questioned my authenticity, and you did it in front of a live studio audience without giving me any heads up that you wanted to go in that direction. That's not asking about my music. That's putting me on trial. And you know what, Keith? Maybe you needed to be put on trial. Kelly fired back, her composure finally cracking completely. Maybe you needed someone to ask you the hard questions instead of letting you coast by on your charm and your accent. Maybe you needed someone to challenge you instead of just throwing you softballs and letting you promote your latest album. The studio audience was completely silent now, some of them looking uncomfortable, others seeming almost mesmerized by the train wreck unfolding before them. Keith stared at Kelly for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. There it is. There's the real Kelly Clarkson. Not the sweet talk show host who claims she just wants to have honest conversations. The one who thinks successful artists need to be taken down a peg. The one who thinks it's her job to humble people who've had the audacity to find success in their field. That is not what I think, and you know it, Kelly shot back. But I do think that successful artists should be able to handle questions about their work without having complete meltdowns. I do think that if you're going to put your music out there for the world to hear, you should be able to discuss it. Like an adult, discuss it like an adult. Keith's voice was getting louder again. Kelly, adults don't ambush each other with loaded questions on live television. Adults don't reference negative articles about their guests without warning them. First, adults don't try to create controversy at someone else's expense. Kelly stood up straighter, matching Keith's intensity. And adults don't throw tantrums when they're asked to engage with different perspectives on their work. Adults don't accuse their hosts of setting them up just because they don't like the direction a conversation is going. Keith took a step back from Kelly, and for a moment, it looked like he might be preparing to leave. But instead, he turned back to face her with renewed fury. You want to know what this is really about, Kelly? This is about the fact that you thought you could use me to create a moment for your show. This is about the fact that you thought the country music guy would be an easy target for some manufactured drama. Keith, that is absolutely ridiculous, and you know it. I have never used a guest to create drama, and I resent the accusation. What happened here today happened because you couldn't handle a simple question about industry criticism. Simple question. Keith laughed harshly. Kelly, there was nothing simple about what you did. You came loaded for bear with that article. Reference. You had your follow-up questions ready, and you probably had your producers in your ear telling you to push harder when I started getting uncomfortable. Kelly's eyes flashed with anger. You know what, Keith? Since you want to make this about my producers and my show, let me tell you something. Every single person on my team was rooting for you today. Every single person here wanted this interview to go well because we respect you as an artist. The only person who turned this into a disaster was you. Is that what you're going to tell yourself? Keith asked, shaking his head. Is that the story you're going to stick with when people ask what happened here today? That I'm just some unstable artist who couldn't handle a routine interview question? I'm going to tell people the truth. Keith, I'm going to tell them that I asked you a legitimate question about your music, and you responded by attacking me personally and questioning my integrity. I'm going to tell them that you turned what should have been a friendly conversation into a hostile confrontation. Keith stared at her for a long moment, and then something seemed to shift in his demeanor. The anger was still there, but underneath, it was something that looked almost like disappointment. You know what, Kelly? You're right about one thing. This conversation is over. But not because I can't handle criticism or because I'm having a breakdown. It's over because I refuse to participate in whatever this is supposed to be. He started to turn away from her, but Kelly wasn't finished. Keith, you can walk away if you want to, but running away from difficult conversations isn't going to solve anything. It's not going to make the criticism go away, and it's certainly not going to make you look better than you do right now. Keith stopped and turned back to face her one last time. Look better, Kelly. I'm not trying to look better. I'm trying to maintain some shred of dignity in a situation where you've made that almost impossible. I came here today expecting to have a conversation about my music with someone I thought understood what it meant to be an artist. Instead, I got ambushed by someone who apparently thinks my success makes me fair game for this kind of treatment. Keith, for the last time, you were not ambushed. You were interviewed. There's a difference, even if your ego won't let you see it. Keith shook his head one final time, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment that seemed to sum up everything that had gone wrong. My ego. Kelly, this was never about my ego. This was about respect. This was about treating a guest with basic professional courtesy. And you failed on both counts. With those words hanging in the air, Keith Urban turned and walked away from the interview set, leaving Kelly Clarkson standing alone in front of a stunned studio audience. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Keith's footsteps echoing through the studio as he headed for the exit. Kelly stood there for a moment, her chest rising and falling as she tried to process what had just happened. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the silent studio. Well, I guess that's a wrap on today's interview with Keith Urban. We'll be right back after this commercial break. But as the camera stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, it was clear that this wasn't just the end of an interview. It was the end of any professional relationship between two artists who had just burned every bridge between them in the most public way possible. What did you think about this